Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Hakim Khatib. I'm a research fellow at Frankfurt Research Center on Global Islam at the Frankfurt University, Goethe Frankfurt University, and the editor-in-chief of Maastricht Politics and Culture Journal. I must say, it's a quite privilege to be here with our distinguished guests. Today's panel is about making sense of the Middle East. It's quite a complicated topic. Hopefully we're going to wrap it up within 1 hour. Yeah, and then we would have 30 minutes for questions, and we'll see how it goes. Right, so before we go into the topic, it would be nice to introduce our panelists. I'll start with Mr. Jeremić. He's the president of the Center of International Relations and Sustainable Development. It's a global public policy think tank based in Belgrade. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the quarterly magazine Horizons, Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development. And he's also the leader of Serbia's opposition party, People's Party. He has a quite extensive CV, but I'd like to add just one very significant and perhaps interesting information. He was Serbia's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2007 to 2012. Quite impressive, right? So, and he has several publications in New York Times, Washington Post, International Herald, Tribune, and so on and so forth. So it would be easy to read some of his content. Right. The next panelist is Mr. Daniel Levy. He's the president of the U.S. Middle East Project. It's a non-governmental policy institute, focuses on Israel, Palestine issues. And previously, between 2012 and 2016, he was director for the Middle East and North Africa at the European Council for Foreign Relations. And he was also a senior fellow and director of the New America Foundation's Middle East Task Force in Washington, D.C. And he participated also, that's quite impressive, he participated in the peace talks during the government of Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin, right? So our next panelist, Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, he's the executive director of the America's Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the head of the Institute's Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Program. He's also the author of the book Asia's Latent Nuclear Powers, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, Overcoming Pakistan's Nuclear Dangers. And he is also the editor of 6 books on the matter in different regions in the world. And he's also the co-founder of the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium. And he has, this is also impressive, he has a 26-year career at the US Department of State, and including as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation. And he's still yeah, hopefully soon. Our next panelist is Dr. Florence Gaub. She's the Deputy Director of the European Union Institute for Security Studies. She's based in Paris. I just learned about that now. And right, and she focuses on conflict, security, and regional geostrategy of the Arab world, and also works on Arab military forces in general. She did her PhD on Lebanese army at the Humboldt University of Berlin in Germany, and she holds degrees from, and this is impressive, Sciences Po Paris, the Sorbonne, and the University of Munich. Right. Our last panelist, Mr. Mike Young. He's a senior editor at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, and he's also the editor of Diwan, which is a blog produced by the Carnegie Middle East program. And until 2016, he was also the opinion page editor at the Daily Star newspaper in Beirut, and he writes a bi-weekly commentary for the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi. And also, this is quite impressive. You've been, you have a quite long history of editing in different organizations and websites and blogs and programs and yeah. So the last one about his editing career, he's a contributing editor at Reason magazine and Reason.com in the United States. Right. Of course, he published also several books. One of them is The Ghost of Martyrs Square, an eyewitness account of Lebanon's life struggle, published in 2010, ranked one of the best outstanding books by the Wall Street Journal at that time. Right. So now we go to our topic, which is making sense of turmoil in the Middle East. I'd like to start with 2011. So in 2011, uprising swept the region, bringing down long-lasting dictatorships, or perhaps, and the trajectories of the aftermath of those uprisings were completely different from one country to another, understandably, but then could be labeled as violent and non-violent. Violent, as we witness now, the conflict in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and non-violent, or less violent, to be accurate, in Egypt and Tunisia. What I would like to say here, that when people went in 2011 asking, or perhaps demonstrating for democracy, liberties, and dignity, and all those things which are nice, but then ended up with ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. So perhaps it was a revolution against a revolution, perhaps. We would see if you would have any points about it. But now what we understand that from the debate, that terrorism, rise of Islamism, Salafism, Wahhabism, economic underachievement, high unemployment rates, lack of proper education, increase of militarization, migration, Iran's controversial nuclear policies, and also worsened relationship with Turkey in relation to the EU. These are quite gloomy topics when we talk about the region. So perhaps you'd have a different perspective. So my question, the first one, and this is for all of you, where are we now, from your perspective, in relation to the Middle East? And I'd like to start with Mr. Jeremić.
Well, thank you very much for this most kind introduction, and I want to start by saying how grateful I am to be here and to participate for the first time in the Belgrade Security Forum, and also to be joined here by such a distinguished group of scholars. I cannot really call myself a scholar. I was more of a practitioner on foreign affairs, having served in the government as foreign minister, having also been involved in certain ways in the UN. But given that I'm not a scholar and that I'm trying to understand from the side what's going on, I always try to look at complex systems like I was trained to do, and I was trained as a physicist. I was trained to look at complex developments in nature. And when there's something very, very complex in nature, then you try and go back to the fundamental forces, and in nature, these forces are physics and chemistry. In geopolitics, those equivalents could be history and geography, and an important corollary, which is culture and religion. So I think it is very, very difficult to explain the current tumults in the Middle East if you decide that 2011 is going to be the starting point. So I think we need to go deeper into those fundamental forces that are up to this day important, significant, and somebody can claim determinant factors and drivers of instability in the Middle East. And I'd like to raise one that has been present since the emergence of Islam, which is the rivalry between Arabs and Persians. And in today's version, in today's episode of it, is the rivalry between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its allies and the Islamic Republic of Iran. It seems to be that in the period that you're emphasizing, the Arab world and the kingdom, as the leader of the Arab world, has been on the back foot. Given the two most important tools of control and significance that were at the disposal of the kingdom are the Arab world since the 7th century, which is religion, and as of the 20th century, which is oil. I think that both are right now in a convoluted state, religion in particular with extremism and jihadism, and oil because of the global economic developments, the price of oil, and the lessened dependence of critical actors on oil, starting with the United States. So there seems to be an array of issues and problems that are now faced by the kingdom and by the Arab world in particular, that seems to be bereft of clear leadership and also unity, which is not something new when it comes to unity, but not just Yemen and Syria and Qatar's blockade, which hasn't proved to be as successful as some people planned this to be, are one of the demonstrations, are amongst the demonstrations of the weaknesses. But if we want to really talk about the present, and I know that this is not probably the best moment to go deep into history, which I try to go to when I want to understand what is going on, I would raise four issues, and perhaps we can touch upon any of them in the later part of the discussion. It is a religious extremism. It is the strength and the resilience of Iran. It is the re-emergence of Turkey as an historic player, which has not been around and so influencing in the past century, but it is right now. And the fourth, last that I would raise, I'm not giving you a conclusive list, but I think certainly not least, is the divergence of interests between the United States and the Arab world led by the Kingdom of the Saudi Arabia. So these are the four current and present issues that we might want to get slightly deeper into if there's time.
Right. We'll see if the other panelists would agree on all the points raised. Mr. Levy, would you like to go?
Go?
No, I mean...
Sorry, I couldn't resist. First of all, thank you to the Belgrade Security Forum for putting this panel on, giving me an opportunity to be with this group of panelists. If you've chosen to spend an hour and a half thinking and talking about the Middle East, I hope you at least availed yourself of a lot of wine before you came in. Your starting point, Hakim, was 2011, and it's wrong to take that as a moment in history without looking at what predated it and how we got to that point. You weren't doing that, but I think if you look at the situation today, on almost any measure, we're in slippage and we've gone backwards and things have gotten worse. One of the things that I would say by way of starting is that upheaval is still less than a decade ago. And we have to be respectful of the fact that the processes of change take time. And I still think we're living through a period that is a period of fluidity and change, and the direction of travel is not cast in stone. So that backlash that we've seen, I think, is not necessarily a foreteller of where things will continue to go. What I thought I would do is just look at kind of where we are on the local level within the various polities, on the regional level, and then on the geopolitical level. In terms of the Middle East today, in the closing phase of the second decade of the 21st century. And, you know, at the local level, I think the things that, in part at least, gave rise to those upheavals that have been well documented in the lead up to 2011 for over a decade by the Arab Human Development Reports that the UN was putting out. Problems in governments, in knowledge acquisition, in women's empowerment, endemic lack of freedom and rights. Those problems are still there. And if anything, look more hopeless today. The sense of representative governance, agreed rules of the game, enfranchisement. The exception is Tunisia. We now have, you know, ongoing conflicts in places that look like they might be going into a better space. Yemen has to be the most terrible example of that. And you also have today, which I think is of more recent vintage, I would say increasingly a debate in the West as to whether this matters. And as to whether human rights and democracy are actually issues that we should be involving or troubling ourselves with. That has obviously been given a huge... Look, the West was not particularly good or consistent or avoiding of hypocrisy when it came to promoting those things in the Middle East or anywhere else. But there was something of a consensus that even if we weren't great at doing those things, they did matter. And they did matter to stability, and they did matter to avoiding instability and avoiding radicalization. And that, I would argue, is no longer a shared conception. And that very much comes from where the current US administration is. And I think that this general rise in neo-authoritarianism, in illiberal democracy, ethnocracy, etc., which Europe is certainly not been spared either, that has a knock-on effect. So number one, on the local level. Secondly, on the regional level, and you referred to what I think is the defining fault line in the region today, which is this Saudi, Iran, zero-sum approach. Yep. And look, what you have today is a Middle East state system where the pillars, the states that were seen as the leading Arab states, for whatever internal problems they were facing, are all basically in collapse or brittle and very self-absorbed. Iraq, we're in this 15 years plus since the invasion. Of course, under Saddam, Iraq was hardly strutting its stuff on the world stage in great ways. Syria, we all know what's happened in Syria, and Egypt. And although Egypt hasn't collapsed in the way that Egypt and that Syria and Iraq have, you do have an Egypt that I think is not playing that kind of regional role. Into that void, partially into that void, stepped to Saudi Arabia that I think it's very clear is not ready for prime time. And in that situation, you've always also seen overreach by others. I think Turkey is now considering and looking at what the implications of its overreach are. I think the Israelis are deep into overreach when it comes to the regional role they're seeking to play. And today, what you have is a situation whereby outside powers, and again, I'm going to especially focus here on the US, rather than saying zero sum does not work for anyone, how do we de-escalate some of these conflicts? If we can't solve them, let's at least manage them. If we can't manage them, let's try and freeze them. Perhaps at some stage, let's try and resolve them. Rather than pursuing that, the Trump administration is empowering the zero-sum approach and the overreach, especially of the Saudis and the Israelis, in the region. And so that brings me to a final comment, which is on the geopolitics. And on the geopolitics, I'd say that the Middle East was a contested space historically. It was a contested space during the Cold War. I think we went through a period which could probably be described as a more uncontested Pax Americana, and that's not where we are today. Today, you have the significant reemergence of Russia as an actor in the Middle East. It's a militarized Russia in the Middle East. I don't want to exaggerate that because I do not think the Russian project for the Middle East is a hegemonic project. But I do think it's significant, and it's certainly significant when you have a Russia that is actually able to talk to and deal with and have very workable relations with all the actors across the region, unlike the Americans. Putin and Bibi are on the phone every few days. The Iranians are in and out of Moscow. Syria, Iraq, Iran, Hezbollah are all tight with the Russians. The Israelis, the Turks, the Gulfis are all close to the Russians. Sisi, I think, is still in Moscow at the moment. I think it's a 3-day visit. That's a significant thing. And without wanting to exaggerate their role, throw China into the mix, because the vision of a Eurasian-centered world and the vision of the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese can't really work if you have this big black hole that is dysfunctionality and war everywhere in the Middle East. So the Middle East is crucial to that Chinese vision, which doesn't mean that the Chinese are ready to step up and take on responsibility for the security equities in the region, but it does mean that we're going to see them increasingly in that space. So you have a local, regional, and geopolitical contestation, which so far has boded very ill for the region. Those things all have implications for Europe and what Europe's role should be, but perhaps that will be part of our conversation.
Right. Thank you very much. Would you like to add to that?
So Hakim, you asked where we are today. Let me be the optimist. We're much better
please.
from my perspective than we were in 2011. My perspective is the nuclear set of issues. And in 2011, Iran was racing ahead to get the potential to build a nuclear weapon. And there was a lot of fear that the United States and Israel were going to go to war with Iran to stop them. So today, thanks to the leadership of the European Union and the other 5 powers, Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, and they've been stopped from all paths to getting a nuclear weapon for the next 15 years or so. Those world leaders in the European Union realized that all of the problems that we're talking about in the Middle East would be much, much worse if Iran had a nuclear weapon and if Saudi Arabia was competing with them also to have a nuclear weapon. So they emphasized the singular issue of the gravest importance is stopping Iran's nuclear program. Now, unfortunately, I joined Daniel in criticizing my own government. They have a different perspective. Instead of focusing exclusively on the nuclear program, they want to deal with all of the problems Iran poses. And there are a lot of them. In May, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a so-called policy speech enumerating the 12 areas of problematic behavior that Iran would have to change before the United States would be willing to negotiate with them. 12 issues. When you have 12 priorities, you don't have any priorities. And Pompeo added another priority yesterday in an article in World Foreign Affairs. He added human rights. Poor Mr. Pompeo. What bad timing to criticize Iran for human rights. He wrote this before Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. If only Iran had Saudi Arabia's level of human rights, eh? So what's the U.S. policy? I'm not sure. The pressure that the United States is putting on Iran and that it wants every country represented here also to put seems to have three possible objectives. One, most charitably, is to persuade Iran to change its behavior, to put so much economic pressure that they give up and change all these 12, now 13 areas of bad behavior. A second objective might be not just behavior change, but regime change. This is something that the current National Security Advisor, John Bolton, has talked about before he became the National Security Advisor. And if you read Mr. Pompeo's remarks, you might see some hint that regime change is the policy, but I'm not sure. A third objective might be to put so much pressure on Iran to goad Iran into responding in a way that then the United States could use its military might to put an end to this problem once and for all. Iran is not so unwise as to respond to this pressure in this way. So far, Iran is keeping its part of the nuclear deal, adhering to all of the limits while receiving few of the benefits. And the question in my mind is, how long can Iran continue this imbalanced deal? Well, I talk to Iranians a lot. I had a meeting with Foreign Minister Javad Zarif recently in New York, and my impression is that Iran can continue to uphold the deal as long as it gets what is most important. And you may not believe this, but what he said is the most important thing is respect. Respect. And that's why the role of the European Union is so important, I believe, because European Union gives Iran respect. They won't be able to give too much economic benefit, but they treat Iran with respect, and that might be enough to persuade Iran to uphold the deal for another 2.5 years until America comes to its senses, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gaub, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'm gonna join the ranks here on being a bit more optimistic. My boyfriend asked me once, in the 15 years that you've worked on the Middle East, what was the best time to work on it? And I said, it's today. And I'll tell you why. Not because I love conflict and dead people, obviously not. But why is 2018 better than 2008? If you think back in time, for those of us who can remember that. I remember the region before 2011 to be sclerotic, static, and old. Now it's dynamic and young. You can interpret the Hashd al-Shabi, for instance, in Iraq. A lot of them who joined the militias were actually involved in localized civil society organizations, so the call to arms, not for all of them anyway, was not just, I want to beat up some Sunnis, but it's actually a genuine concern for the country. The same goes with the Libyan militias that you see today. You could even go as far as interpreting ISIS as young people being fed up with how things are. And in 2008, that's not what was there. In 2008, everything was just accepting of the situation, and it was not a good situation. The second thing, I think it was politically apathetic, and now it's become politically self-aware. I think that's, echoing Daniel's words, that's something that people forget when they look at just today and they see the pain and the bloodshed and insecurity, that they think, okay, the transitions have failed. But you cannot put self-awareness back in a bottle. And I'll give you the example of Roger Bannister, who was the first human to run a mile in under 4 minutes. What was so special about him wasn't actually that he broke that record. It's that after he broke it, he was the first human to break it. within months, his record was broken and broken and broken. So why all of a sudden did people run faster and faster and faster? Because he had proven that it was feasible. And 2011, in fact, even 2013, has taught the Egyptians that they can bring down their government if they don't like it. The Tunisians have had the same lessons, the Libyans have the same lessons. So that political awareness is not to be undone. You cannot lock it up in prison. And I think that's priceless. The other reason why I think it's better today is obviously it was very much offline. And by offline, I don't just mean offline as in off the internet. It was also not connected in any way. There was, of course, this theoretical idea of the Arab nation, but you see it much more today. If you go on Instagram, if you go, Vogue Arabia, I know it might not be the example, but it was launched now. Why now, I wonder? Because there is a positive Arab identity in the making. Yes, it's winter, but I can see the first signs of something that is much more than ballet dancers and bombers and billionaires, which used to be the Hollywood stereotype of what Arabs are. And then lastly, regionally, I think it's also changed. Personally, I found the years before 2011 quite boring. Everybody said Egypt was the mother of the Arab nation. Yeah, but what did Mubarak ever do that was really great for this region? So we have now new regional actors emerging. Yes, they break a lot of porcelain. I'm not saying I like things the way they are, but, and this is where I echo Daniel again, if you look at transitology, the few literature that there actually is on transition to democracy, find me the country where transition to democracy was a straightforward line, where one day people and decision makers woke up and said, you know what, let's just go to the polls. That never happened, including in my country, where people had to go first through dictatorship, back to democracy, back to authoritarianism before they reached their goal. So why would it be any different? On average, this process takes at least 15 years, but that's the average, so I think it's way too soon to say 2011 was a failure. So it's painful, but I think there's still all these elements that I see in the making for something much, much more positive in the future.
Thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this positive note. It is quite interesting. I have a few questions about it, but perhaps I'll come back to you later. Mr. Young, would you like to add a few statements
Is this working?
about the situation?
I'm sorry not to share the optimism. I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that in the coming decades, it will be the end of the rentier system in the Middle East. The role of oil will gradually decline in the coming decades. And the role of oil has been fundamental in the region in the post-World War II period, even before, of course. But in terms of Arab societies, not even societies that were not oil producers benefited in some fashion from the oil rent. And what worries me, and I think it worries many people, is that in the coming decades, all the dynamics that led to 2011, as Daniel was saying, are there. They haven't been in any way removed. In other words, growing populations, larger populations of youths who essentially have no openings in terms of their future, growing polarization, growing repression, and now, unfortunately, with the experience of 2011. So in other words, the mistakes that they could have made before, now they're better prepared to undermine any kind of revolutionary uprising than they were before. All these dynamics make me much more pessimistic. The fundamental question, as far as I'm concerned, in the Middle East is the question of the role of the state. This has never really been answered. In the post-colonial period, we've tried many different experiments in the region. The Arab nationalist state under Abdel Nasser and the Ba'athi regimes in Syria and Iraq, where effectively, you would have a system that completely repressed any idea of primary identities such as sectarianism or tribalism under this sort of fictitious banner of Arab nationalism, of the Arab nation, of a supranational identity almost. And then what we saw in 2011 was that, in a way, Arab societies, a number of them, collapsed back into these primary identities of sectarianism. And then you have sort of one country, well, Iraq perhaps being a second, but one country that, in a way, embraced this sectarian identity, which is my country, and far be it from me to hold it up as an ideal model to follow. I'm speaking of Lebanon, because of course we had our own civil war between 1975 and 1990. But there you have another model, a model that basically embraces differences and that, in a way, has created a system that is very far from perfect, that is in fact completely dysfunctional, but to a certain extent has maintained an element of liberalism, because the communities cannot dominate each other, so they tend to, in a way, cancel each other out. But it has created another problem, a fundamentally threatening problem, is that it's created a state that is weak, which from my perspective as a libertarian is not a big problem, but in this weak state, of course, we had the emergence of a non-state actors in the last 40 years, the PLO in the late 1960s until 1982, and today, of course, another non-state actor, which is Hezbollah, which does pose a fundamental threat to the entity that is Lebanon. So here you have these models that in their own way have failed. What will emerge as the new Arab state model? And I'm afraid I see no answer to that. As I said, I think the instruments of repression have in a way been reinforced. Even Saudi Arabia, which was never a democracy, but in many regards was a system based on equilibriums within the royal family. That is going out the window. In Egypt, we have a vastly more repressive order than what Mubarak had in place. I agree with you, he wasn't a great inspiration, but he wasn't a thug. Today, Sisi is a thug. And so, you know, this is the big question. How will the Arabs be able to define their state and replace what they have now, particularly in a period after the oil, after this rentier wealth was in place, as their societies get younger with a larger and larger pool of disaffected youth? I wish I had an answer to that, and I don't, and that's why I'm more pessimistic.
Right. Yeah. As you see, most of the answers here spoke of conflict rather than any close threat of peace in the region. And before 2011, and I took 2011 just to kick and start, so it's not the point to talk about 2011. But before that time, it was like 10 years ago, we used to speak about the the Israel-Palestine conflict. And now we speak about the Syrian conflict, we speak about the Yemeni conflict, and we speak about, and then you mentioned yourself the non-state actors, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, and also militias in Libya, in Syria, and in Iraq. So it seems that all contributors are going towards instability based, as Mr. Jeremić said, on divergent interests amongst actors, state or non-state, internal or external. So my question would be, are there any actors or any hope of contributors for stability? So I would like to start with you. Perhaps you touched about the issue between the regional rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia for a regional sphere of influence. So perhaps you'd like to start from there.
Well, the short answer to your question is no. If you ask me, and I apologize for being perhaps more pessimistic than some of the other fellow participants. But under the current circumstances and in the light of those rivalries, that I mentioned, and other people touched upon much more eloquently than myself. I honestly think that under the current circumstances, the positive developments in scenario cannot be easily imagined outside the hope of global cooperation between the critical external actors to this. And when I talk about external actors, then first and foremost mean the United States, obviously, but also Russia and China as external actors. I don't want to call Turkey an external actor. It's very much of an internal actor, a regional actor. Of course, Israel is a very important actor, but it is very much of a regional actor. And in the past, there's been certainly more significant than today, the role of the European Union. But given the current tumults and political developments within the European Union, I fail to see European Union short term as an actor in the line of significance of the former three. So it's going to be a story of whether we're going to see in the future cooperation or competition, concord, if you will, or increased rivalry between those main actors. I fail to see a near-term trajectory in which the United States and China in particular, but also Russia, are going to try and be on the same page, bar an unforeseen catastrophe that could be a natural disaster or something else. So for as long as there is going to be an increased rivalry and competition in that fragile region of the Middle East, it's going to be refracted through I am afraid, more trouble that's going to continue having spillover effects to all corners of the world, and in particular the one that we live in, which is Europe.
Mr. Levy, Israel and Saudi Arabia had, or perhaps with also other Arab states, they had cooperation, but let's say covert cooperation deals, but recently they're coming more vocal about it. So do you think that could be a contributor towards stability if Saudi Arabia, Egypt, perhaps the UAE join in any kind of cooperation on any level? Could that perhaps contribute to stability in the region?
No, not at all, because the basis for the cooperation is to drive further instability. The basis for the cooperation is to use that against another regional actor or set of regional actors. I think covert still characterizes most of the cooperation, and I think that will probably continue to be the case. So, I think the kind of Kushner, MBS, Netanyahu triangle with the Emirati Crown Prince, MBZ, kind of somewhat in the mix as well, it would be very hard on any score to say, well, that's fabulous. That's going to be a net driver of greater regional harmony and de-escalation, and it's simply not what it's designed to do. I mean, if you look at what was said here, and I'm all in favor, and I myself, given a somewhat over the horizon time trajectory, I can see those contributors and I can be more positive. But when one tries to come up with the shorter term things, personally, I think we're closer to war with Iran than we ever were. Especially with John Bolton sitting as National Security Advisor. I find the idea of young people taking their fate into their own hands great, I find the vehicle through which you do that as the mass arming of young men a long, long way from being great. So none of that means that there aren't people in civil society organizing, educating, strategizing, and doing phenomenal things across the board, across the region. But none of those people are anywhere near to political power. So I think that the contributions from those in political power in the region, I mean, look, are the Omanis still offering their services to try and do quiet mediation? Sure. Are the Kuwaitis trying to repair the intra-GCC split? Sure they are. Qatar used to host all kinds of interesting efforts at being a kind of Norway of the Middle. But the leading actors are all set on kind of bludgeon ahead and destroy mode, and the lead external actors are of a similar ilk. Because I do think that you can find very significant and worth pursuing overlapping interests between the US, Russia, and China in the Middle East. But the leaders in place today are not pursuing those. And that's where the short-term horizons look so bleak.
Right. When he spoke about Iran and Israel, and that they're closer to war more than any other time, you raised your brow. So perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Well, yeah, I mean,
And how
Daniel was talking about the United States and Iran being closer to war, and I raised my brows because Iran has been so careful, and vis-a-vis Israel. You know, Israel has carried out 200 or more strikes against Iranian military in Syria.
Right.
And Iran's response has been nothing.
But John Bolton isn't careful.
Well, Bolton's not careful, but, you know, United States kind of needs some excuse. Bolton needs some excuse to go to war, and I don't think Iran's going to give him that excuse. When I try to, think positively about can any, good come of the dire situation we're in, I look at the House of Saud, which is in some turmoil right now. There must be talk internally about whether it's time for a change of the crown prince. Now, probably not, because the United States is not putting any pressure, but MBS has so overstepped all bounds, all norms of civilization. And I mean, it's the fact that he's killing dozens of children in Yemen, that doesn't worry us too much. But Jamal Khashoggi, is known to many of us. So maybe they will change. Maybe they would have a new crown prince, and maybe that would be an excuse to get out of Yemen, or better yet, to come to some engagement with Iran over Yemen. It's such an obvious case where diplomacy can solve the Yemen problem. Right. But it can't get to diplomacy because Saudi Arabia won't talk to Iran until Iran leaves Arab lands, and Iran is not going to leave Arab lands. And if some external forces would put pressure on both of these countries, I think at least the Yemen problem could get better.
Right. Thank you very much. Perhaps I would like to move with the conversation a bit further and speak about the youth and the increase in numbers of youngsters in the region. I think it was in the 1950s, it was estimated that there are 150 million people living in the region, including the non-Arabic speaking countries, and now there are over 400 million. So it's a huge change. Most of them are youngsters, and according to, and I'd like to quote here, according to the United Nations, conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa are depriving more than 13 million children of education. And this is not only in Syria and Yemen, but also in some countries like Egypt or Tunisia, relatively stable places. And when it comes to unemployment, So it's the highest in the world. It's estimated in 2014 to be 46% amongst women and 24% amongst men. My question to you, with those very pessimistic numbers, was like perhaps facts. So how could the youth be contributors to stability, or perhaps one day, let's dream a bit, democratization? Because as we understand that societies should change themselves, change doesn't come from outside. So it's, what could they, if you would imagine, or perhaps if you would imagine is a good word, a scenario of how the youth could contribute to a significant change towards democratization. And
I think you can actually even turn it upside down. There's probably never been democratization without youth. I mean, every time you've had a massive push for democracy, it was because there was a large youth cohort. I mean, think of Germany in the 1930s, you know, the back and forth in the Weimar Republic, all over Europe, 1968. Okay, we were already democracies then, but, you know, push for even more liberalization and so forth. This was all the outcome of large cohorts of young people being fed up with the situation. So I hear all of you. I also share your analysis on all the ingredients that made 2011 happen in the first place got worse as a result of what happened afterwards. So we will have more instability in the near to medium term. However, I think what we have to look at exactly right now is not just what is bad. You know, it's my firm opinion that whenever something is bad, you should spend more time on thinking about what can I learn here and what can I take away from here rather than just complaining about what's really bad. So what can we learn here is that young people need to be, their energy needs to be fed into something that's constructive. When you have large youth cohorts, you have two correlations, statistically speaking. One is conflict, and the other is economic economic upturns. The reason why the second hasn't happened in the region is because these economies are large, like 1950-style, industrial, state-centered economies. So that we see what these states need to do, and it echoes also what you said, moving away from the rentier model in the oil-producing states, but in those states where it's not oil-producing, like Egypt, for instance, they have to do the transition that Europe is already doing away from manufacturing, industrial societies to knowledge-based, service-centered societies. So that is something they had to do anyway. And in a sense, these large youth cohorts are pushing the leaders to do that, and they're not doing it, which is why the situation has gotten worse. So Egypt, for instance, has resorted to very typical 1950s style measures like, oh yeah, let's just build a huge extra Suez Canal. Large infrastructure projects create jobs. Yes, but that's not the type of job that's sustainable. So that is a very painful economic transition that had to be done anyway. And in that sense, I would say, maybe 70 years from now, people will say, actually, thank you to these people because they forced us to do all these reforms, even though it was very painful in terms of human life, in terms of economic hits, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't see this large group of young people necessarily as a threat, because we have no other choice anyway. We have to do with them something that is constructive. Just to end on a last note, Daniel, you took issue with the fact that these young and active people, they take up guns. Yeah, they take up guns because there's nothing else to do. In Libya, after Gaddafi fell, there was a large study done amongst the Thawar, the young men with guns that overthrew him, essentially. And of the 125,000, guess how many actually wanted to be in the army? 6,000. All the others wanted to have a small loan to open their own shop. So they all wanted to get into, I don't know, how many internet cafes does Libya need? Probably not that many, but that's because Libya is one of those economies that is not yet fit for the small, medium enterprises that could absorb these young people.
Right, Mr. Young, would you like to add to that about the youth issue?
Not really. The youth issue doesn't really excite me because I really don't have that much hope in youth. I mean, the point is, yes, youth can take these societies in any direction. The thing is, though, basically the demands of the youth are not being, if you don't have jobs, if you don't have a future, if you can't express yourself, then we shouldn't expect that youth is going to be an element of stability. It's not. The question on stability, though, I think is an interesting one, because there was a time when the abuses of the Arab regimes was accepted because they brought stability. And to a certain extent, people have not gotten rid of that thinking. To this day, Bashar al-Assad, though he is a man who is engaged in mass murder of his own society, is seen as somehow an element of stability because he, for a moment, pretended to stand against the Islamic State. And this illusion has become generalized. People believe that in Syria, it was a war of the regime against Islamists. It was much more complicated than that. The Islamists didn't enter the scene until 2 years and 3 years into the conflict. But the fact of the matter is stability, in a way that you asked about, in many respects, it can be exactly the problem, because if we want to engage in pursue stability, then we get people like Mubarak, and we get people to an extent like the Assad regime, people like Saddam Hussein's regime. But Daniel said something that I found quite interesting and quite true. In 1975-76, the Lebanese Civil War began, and it was resolved by the inter-Arab state system, by the Arab League at the time. Now, the Arab League was divided between, on the one hand, Egypt and Syria, but they did eventually come out with a solution on Lebanon. It was not a great solution, but it was a solution. It sort of brought a temporary end to those 2 years of fighting. Today, the Arab state system has collapsed. The Arab League has become so polarized. So if I could just take issue with something you said, or that you threw out, the idea that change doesn't come from outside. Well, let's be serious. Change is not going to come in the near future from inside the Arab world or from Arab states. So I think that it's a mistake to completely reject the idea that change cannot come from outside. Now, I'm not suggesting that Western armies should invade the Middle East. That's probably not going to work. It's not going to be acceptable in the West, and it's not going to be acceptable in the Arab world. But it's inevitable that with the problems of the future in the Middle East, that something, the outside world, the West, the United States, China, all these countries have to think in terms of the growing problems that are going to emerge from the region. The idea that somehow what's in the region stays in the region is nonsense. Nothing in the Middle East stays within the Middle East. Refugees, radical Islamic movements, all this we've seen in the last few years has basically extended out of the Middle East into the depths of Western society. The refugee problem almost broke apart the European Union. It still has I think, the power to do that. And that's one reason I believe the Europeans may eventually turn around and begin financing reconstruction in Syria. They will look over the crimes of the Assad regime because they're afraid of new refugee flows, and they prefer that the refugees go back and work in Syria in rebuilding the country that Assad destroyed. So, you know, my point is basically we cannot create this artificial borderline between what's in the region and what's outside. And I think it would be useful to begin a discussion on how the outside world can assist in stabilizing the Middle East in some way.
Right.
Just a thought.
I agree with you totally, but it has to come from the inside and the outside. But if you don't know how to do something, so how would you do it? So this is the question, and that's why you mentioned earlier that it's the role of state, the definition of state in the region is very important and hasn't been clear yet what role Arab states should play within their borders before we speak about the geostrategic dimension of it. But this is the last question, and it would be interesting from your perspective to pinpoint common interests between Middle Eastern countries and Europe or European countries, and how could that lead in a way or another to a positive change? I'm not going to say stability in this case. I would say just positive change in any measure. So would you like to start with the...
I think it's very obvious what is the common interest, but what's, I'm afraid, also very obvious is that this common interest is not currently being pursued, or at least not very elegantly so, which is peace and prosperity and progress and less radicalism and so on and so forth, which means less migrants and everything. I'm afraid that Europe, which is a difficult political space right now, given all the internal divisions and discussions and fragility of the political fabric or institutional fabric and emergence of populism and so on and so forth. I think that one policy that Europe seems to be converging on with regard to the fact that they are aware that what is in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East, but has a spillover effect. And that becomes relevant for the part of the world where we live in, which is the Balkans. I think that Europe is investing into a good buffer zone, which is the Balkans. The remnants of the Balkans that, for various reasons, failed to accede to the European Union membership in the past 10 or 15 years. So they are very, very aware of the regional dynamics. They are aware of the hopelessness of the short-term horizon when it comes to the clouds in the short-term horizon. They're very, very murky. They are driven by short-term political motives, which is not just common to Europe. It happens to be the moment in the whole world. But I think that this part of the world where we sit, Balkans, that is Serbia, Macedonia, and Bosnia, and so on and so forth, is once again in our history going to play a role of a buffer zone. In the past, this buffer zone was to keep Ottomans at bay. Now, we don't really talk about, Ottoman armies invading or trying to invade Europe, but we are talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of migrants that can potentially, again, and in the very near future, start going towards Europe. And it's important to be able to have a geographic and political space which is conducive to absorbing these shocks, including migrant shocks. And that's my best explanation of current feebleness when it comes to European take on some of the developments regionally that can hardly be described as fully in harmony with what we call European values of the 21st century.
Right, thank you. Mr. Levy?
I mean, you see, I agree that yes, on paper the common interest is easy. In practice, it's a long way from being so, and I think that's an interesting point you just made, Luke. But perhaps there's an intersection there, because I'll maybe this may be a bit Pollyannish. I think one of the things that the regional actors have in common right now, in terms of their self-preservation, is in what appears to be a moment of global fluidity. They don't want to place the wrong bet. And therefore, I think all of them are trying to work out what the right spread I'm not going to put everything on black or on red. I'm going to spread it around a little bit. Well, who knows where, sometimes this president sounds very libertarian in America. That's not where it's gone, but it looked like it could lurch in that direction. What does it mean having Russia back? What does it mean China's role in the future? And also, there is still some consideration given to Europe's role as a global player. Now, not necessarily Europe qua Europe, because of the inability to do joined up foreign policy, et cetera, as a group. So that's coming out of the region. And I think coming out, at least from some of the key European actors, is this sense of we've got to be able to do more in this region that so spills over and impacts us. So maybe in that interplay, there are things that Europeans could be doing to build the coalitions that can have that impact from the outside. Because I don't think Assad could have done what he'd done in Syria without the outside empowerment from Russia. I don't think the Saudis could be doing what they're doing in Yemen without the outside empowerment from America. I don't think Israel could be doubling down on its bed of denying the Palestinians any rights or freedoms without the outside empowerment from the United States. And none of those are doing anyone any good. And I think enough Europeans understand that maybe there's a role in trying to carve out the international coalitions, just as Europe played a lead role in what eventually became the contact group, what eventually became the JCPOA nuclear deal with Iran. But I would also say that Europeans, we've got to up our own game, and we've got to get our own act together. And part of the impact, whether it's on the security angle or whether it's on the migration angle, is how we're handling ourselves domestically and collectively. Let me just say one other thing on something that came up, which struck me when it was being said, is I think the bet that Saudi Arabia is making, at least in terms of democracy, is that you can substitute, for young people and their aspirations, you can substitute an entertainocracy, which of course isn't a word, but you know what I mean, for democracy. If you give young people cinemas and, I don't know, world wrestling championships or boxing or restaurants where young people without gender division can be eating together, then representative governance ain't going to be so uppermost in their minds. And I think that's the bet that the Crown Prince is placing vis-a-vis his own age cohort, vis-a-vis his own generation. I think wrongly, but...
Right. I just would like to add that I lived in Saudi Arabia for a while. And I remember, because people there don't pay taxes, and every time it came up, of course, you have to be careful what you say there. But every time the matter of representation came up, they would say, no taxation, no representation. So they would say that, and it was a running gag. So it was accepting that as a fact. So it's like, we don't pay taxes, so it's okay. So it goes like that. So I agree with you totally with your analysis. I find it very, very accurate. Mr. Fitzpatrick, would you like to add perhaps something in relation to the United States? And it's just a concern, exactly the common interest that could foster a positive development in the region.
You know, I was going to say that there's a diplomatic tactic when problems seem insolvable, one way to try to get across and make them bigger. And so I was thinking of transnational issues on which everyone can agree. And then I was thinking in a European context, and so I was going to say the Paris Climate Accord is something we can all agree on, but then I remembered that. Okay, so, but in my own field, sorry, I have to go say something about nuclear again. I think everybody agrees on the importance of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. At least they say so, and you know, it's really important that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, that Saudi Arabia doesn't, that Turkey, Egypt, you know. So I think that's at least something. And the United States used to exercise leadership in this, and I think they can again, and I hope they will soon. And I'll stop here because I'm interested in questions also from the audience.
Right, but we ran out of time, so would it be okay if we open the stage for questions? So, yeah, we would love to hear your questions, and we would like, yeah, please, go ahead. It would be nice to of course, comments are welcome if they're less than 2 minutes. And if you end them with a question mark, that would be better.
I'll try to. Thank you very much for these really inspiring remarks. My name is Nemanja Starović. I'm BFP alumnus. I have one question for Mr. Fitzpatrick. One of the relations that really defined the modern Middle East, of course, is one between United States and Saudi Arabia, and that strong partnership that spanned the better part of the last century. And to the extent that on many occasions the foreign policy of the United States in the Middle East was strongly influenced by Saudi Arabia as well as Israel and so on. But what we see in the 21st century, that the significance of the Saudi Arabia from the perspective of Washington is really diminishing. I mean, America is not buying as much oil as before. It's producing their own, buying some from Canada and so on. And do you believe that this partnership can be sustained in the long run, in 10 or let's say 20 years? When we see this most recent case of Saudi dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the level of media attention in the United States, this strong criticism of the Saudi Arabia in the last, let's say, 5 days, much stronger than we have in the last 5 years vis-a-vis this horrible situation we have in Yemen and that you mentioned and so on. Do you believe this partnership can be sustained in the long run? Thank you.
Would you like to answer right away?
Of the question, it can't be. It's already falling apart. Members of Congress are lashing out against Saudi Arabia, and because of the less dependency on Saudi oil, undermines what has been the fundamental glue in the relationship. Now today that glue of oil has been replaced by the glue of the common Iran threat. That's what's holding it together today. And that Iran threat will not be there in 10 to 20 years. I think something is likely to change in Iran that makes it a more normal country. And the United States, after some, United States and Iran are more natural partners than United States and Saudi Arabia. And even even officials in the Trump administration, are we on the record? I won't say what I was about to say. I'll stop there.
Right. Any further questions? So we take question there, and then question here, and then question there. Right.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Vera Dragović O'Donnell. I come from UN Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and I think you can already guess what my next question is going to be related to. I was tickled by Ms. Gaub, is that a good pronunciation? Notion on the vibrant Middle East and Southeast Asia and Western Africa, if I can add, because from my line of work, I see that the Middle East being online more and more has contributed to migration to a great extent, and a large number of young people decide that the pasture's greener on the other side and decide to move without necessarily having a clear plan where and how. In some countries, like in Libya, a lot of them have actually become smugglers, and a good part of its economy is based on smuggling, according to some people smarter than me. So I'm interested in your take on that. In fact, what we see in the field, whether it's refugees or migrants, sometimes their need for Wi-Fi, and a strong one, is greater than the need for food, which is something that the organization I work for cannot necessarily provide, because it's not a basic human right yet, if you know what I mean. So, but it seems to be very important. I can understand why and it can be frustrating. And where do you see it going? And do you see it stopping? Because we also don't see people wanting to return home on such large scale, including from the country you originate from. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Perhaps we take the other two questions and then the gentleman who, yeah, the gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Alex Walsh. I'm an independent researcher focused on the Middle East and specifically on security. My question is also for Dr. Gaub. As a quasi-representative of the European Union, as you are, what can the European Union do to water these green shoots of hope in the Middle East? And let's be specific, because it's such a big region. Let's not waffle about the whole thing. I'll give you a choice to either speak about Lebanon or Libya.
Thank you very much. The gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Lazar Akic. I come from North Kosovo. I have a question for Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, a layman's question. If you can just briefly elaborate why it is a disaster for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and on the other hand, it's not a disaster for USA to have the nuclear weapon, or Russia, doesn't matter. So if you can just elaborate and explain why in this case for Iran is a disaster and for the others is not.
Right. Are there any further questions for the moment? Okay, so please.
Yeah, so thank you for your question on connectivity. I think it's obvious that connectivity is an amplifier. So it will amplify everything that's good or that's bad. You said that yourself. I think migration is obviously a much larger issue. The connectivity plays a role. The fact that migrant communities organize themselves, become much more mobile, organize themselves in the country of destination and so forth. That's a fact. It has to do with connectivity worldwide, not just in the region that we speak of. More generally, I think, though, that I see also the seeds, I'm not saying that we're there yet, but the seeds of this connectivity leading to something that's more constructive in the future. I said earlier that all of the things I mentioned, I throw them into the debate deliberately because I think we're being a bit stuck in this gloom and doom. So I do think that once, for instance, Tunisia starts liberalizing its small and medium enterprise funding, that you can think up startups, that maybe you'll have your first successful app developed in Tunisia. Yet you already have apps in Lebanon, for instance, is a particularly good example where connectivity has led to the emergence of smaller enterprises being very operational in the country. So that's what I meant. But your question was more about migration, and I think, well, the country that I was born in, Germany, is in two minds about the Syrian migrants, because there's one actually. What's interesting in the German discourse is that they're not called asylum seekers anymore. I remember during the Balkan Wars, the people that came from the Balkans were called asylum seekers. Today in the German debate, they're called migrants. So I hear an undertone that is they're not going back. So I think this German society, parts of German society, are already getting used to this idea that they will probably stay. So, but there are other parts that, as you well know, are not very happy about that. The larger question is, of course, what does this mean for Syria? What if very important brain power doesn't come back, or political power, and I think the regime will actually make a point also to not want them back. I think what Germany is doing, at least I think so from where I'm sitting, is to make the Syrians not feel that they're going to be stuck in between, that they're welcome to stay if Syria doesn't want them back. But this is the Syrian case, and the much bigger question is, what about, I don't know, the next wave that will come maybe from Egypt or coming through Libya from an sub-Saharan African country who will not be as welcome. So I leave you with more questions than answers, but I think connectivity will play a role in everything that we'll see in the future, be it the communication of these fates. I think we can't underestimate that the Syrian conflict has been, and also the fate of the refugees has been, been a very visual conflict because of connectivity, and on the other hand, has also dominated then the discussion. So I don't know if that really helped you, but I think the question of Wi-Fi being a basic human right, I think we should probably push that, because I'm offline right now and I really hate it. What the EU can do now, I think you know, it's always easy to throw mud at the EU, right? Because we're this big sitting duck in Brussels and we move so slowly, we don't get our act together on anything. But when you look at everything that the EU does, the big advantage of the EU is that it does move so slowly. So what we do is actually, we do stay engaged where other donors are already gone, because our financial cycles are so long. We tend to have the really long-term objective. You can argue that below the big declarations, European foreign policy is actually development policy. And so we stay committed to job creation for young people, human rights, democracy promotion, inclusiveness, everything that does not make the headlines. So that's why it's so easy to say, oh, the EU does nothing. Well, the EU is on all these issues that you mentioned earlier, the EU is aware of that, and it tries to push things into this direction. But like a glacier, you know, it moves so slow that, okay, we got the Nobel Prize already, so we don't need it again, but that we will never make the headlines for having made a positive contribution, because you can never say this is where the EU did this one thing that was truly great. But all the analysis that I've done of what the EU does with all the projects that it finances is it tries to promote, well, ultimately you asked earlier, what's a common interest? I don't think we have diverging interests. We all want the region to be prosper and stable, including people in the region. We just disagree on how to get there. And I think what the EU is doing, it has its long-term vision. Ultimately, I think it's the right vision, but that's because I'm European and I believe in the way that worked for us.
Right.
Oh, on Lebanon or Libya, well, I'll go with Lebanon, obviously, because it's a much better position than Libya. I don't know if you will agree with that, but I think that Lebanon is an example of, it's not part of the Arab Spring cases, but I think it has undergone tremendous change since 2005, since Syria withdrew. Yes, we still have the Taif agreement in place, this highly sectarian system and so forth, but here as well, and maybe you want to comment on that. I see, you know, Madinatun, I see all these slowly moving, emerging civil society movements, people defining them much more as citizens, perhaps, than as members of a particular sect. But the real elephant in the room is, of course, Hezbollah. You know, can Lebanon reform around Hezbollah? Can it become what it wants to be? You know, with Hezbollah as the element that hold it back, I think that's the big question. That's the big elephant in the room. So I don't know, maybe you want to answer that question, but I'm quite positive actually about Lebanon, but it will probably take at least another decade to be as stable as many people want it to be. You don't seem to be as positive.
No, I want to know what the EU can do for Lebanon.
Well, what it does, what I just said, I think all these programs, I mean, we even still talk to Hezbollah's political wing, not to its military wing. It's kind of difficult to make that distinction, but I think Lebanon is one of the countries the EU has actually. Lebanon, Tunisia, and Jordan are the three countries where most of the EU's efforts and money goes to, and the money goes normally, you know how the donor mentality works, to where results are to be expected. Whether that's true or not is a separate story, but I think everything I just mentioned, state stability, you know, strengthening state institutions for them to deliver more, youth unemployment and so forth, the EU does that already.
Perhaps before we move to your question, Mr. Young, would you like to add something about the Lebanese situation? Perhaps that would be in combination with.
Well, I think it's you know, Lebanon is a country where there are possibilities of finance if you're an external actor. I mean, it's a complex society. Civil society is actually quite rich, you know, so it's a relatively democratic country. Whatever people think, it actually is it's a democratic country. So there aren't the same barriers that you see in many other countries. But of course, as you were saying quite correctly, you have this major obstacle, elephant in the room, which is Hezbollah, which effectively drags Lebanon into the center of a regional conflict. And this can be very costly. I'm very worried about the near future because we're in a very dire economic situation. So it adds to the many contradictions. It's taken us into the center of a regional conflict between Israel and Iran, Saudi Arabia as well, and the United States. And this has the potential to undermine all the little positive signs that we were discussing, or that you mentioned in your question.
Right.
The gentleman asked a good layman's question. Why is it such a disaster for Iran to have nuclear weapons and not the United States or Russia, or you could have said any of the other 6 possessors? Yeah. Let me start with the premise that the goal, which I imagine everyone in this room might share, is the goal of a nuclear weapons-free world in which there are no countries that possess nuclear weapons, but not in a way that would lead to the kind of global conflict that ensued even before nuclear weapons came into the world, World War Wars I and II. But I think there are 5 reasons why Iran getting nuclear weapons would be particularly dangerous. One is that it would probably prompt a competition among at least one other state, and probably more, to get their own nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia would not sit by if Iran got nuclear weapons. So you would have a proliferation, a cascade. Secondly, when countries newly acquire nuclear weapons, they don't have the same level of accident prevention, command and control, and other mechanisms to prevent accidental use. And in my own country, we have a terrible record of nuclear command and control, but we finally learned lessons in the United States. So nuclear weapons in Iran's hands would be more likely to go off accidentally. Thirdly, I think it's fair to say that Iran would be more likely to use nuclear weapons than the United States does, because the United States is, in any conventional war, would not need to use nuclear weapons. It has such a preponderance of other weapons, whereas Iran doesn't, and is more likely to think that it needs to use them in an existential threat situation. Fourth, Iran is more likely to share nuclear weapons with non-state actors, or let's call them terrorist groups. The level of corruption in Iran, in the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, the level of interaction between the IRGC and non-state actors in the Middle East that employ terrorist methods is so heavy that I worry very much that a nuclear weapon might be transferred to one of those groups. And fifthly, Iran's not going to get nuclear weapons, because if it goes toward the path of getting them, I'm confident that Israel and the United States are going to go to war to stop them. And probably they'll learn in time. And Iran even going to get nuclear weapons is going to spark a war. And so those are all pretty strong reasons why I think we should all agree Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons.
Right. Yeah, we ran out of time. So I would like to thank our speakers once again. And thank you very much for being here.